We put the fun in quilting by breaking all the rules with 3-yard quilts. Keep watching. Hi, it's Fran Morgan with Fabric Cafe, and today we have so much fun for you because we're going to show you how to break a few rules with 3-yard quilts. Now, 3-yard quilts are an economy quilt in which we try to use every little bit of your fabric to make a really nice size quilt. So we're going to show you how, by doing that, we break a few of the rules and we come out with a really fun quilt to make. So let's start with our first pattern. Our first pattern is stepping up. Now this is a great pattern because really it's kind of like a double focus, and it has this number 3 fabric here that gives it lots of movement and lots of fun to it. So let's talk about fabric positions with this pattern. So our very first rule that we're going to break is established fabric positions for 3-yard quilts. We have a fabric 1, a fabric 2, and a fabric 3. So in this case, what we have is our fabric 1 is this wonderful dot. Now when you're choosing your fabric positions, usually the largest print is your number 1 position or your focus. Now it doesn't have to be that way, but that is the standard way that we usually write them. And in this case, it's this really fun blue and gold dot. Now this one would actually go where this horizontal piece is here. Then we take the number 1 fabric out of the equation and we compare the remaining 2 fabrics. The fabric 2 is usually your lightest, and in this case we have our white with our nice little dot here, and that would go in this position. And our fabric 3, when you compare these two, is the darker of the 2, and it's this gold, and it would go in this position. Now, at Fabric Cafe, we write our patterns so that the fabric 2 usually is the fabric that creates the background. It kind of recedes. And then the fabric 1, which is your focus, is kind of the star of the show. And in this case, it works really well. So you'll see on the screen there that we have a really cool image of this particular quilt stepping up in these 3 fabrics. And you can see how wonderfully it plays off each other, and that fabric 3 gives you a very definitive step up on that. But we're going to break the rule. Now, we're going to move this around a little bit and switch these fabric positions. The next image that you see on the screen is we're putting our original fabric number 1 in the number 3 spot. So keep your eye on that dot. So you saw it on the number 1 position on the first image, and then now here on the second image, you see how we've moved it to the number 3 position and switched those around. Isn't it cool how it changes it up? I just love how you can get really creative with this. Now, we're going to take it one step further. We're going to move it around again. So keep your eye on the dotted fabric and let's put it in the number 2 position. So what we've done is we've taken the number 1 fabric that we originally had, put it in the number 2 position, and you can see how it also looks so much fun. Oh my goodness. So we love to just move those around, get a different look, and break the rule of fabric positions. So let's look at this kit information. This kit is called the Lookout Spot, and the number for this is 8022369, and the pattern is called Stepping Up. Our second rule that we love to break is using a width of fabric strip for one purpose, and we're talking about partial assemblies and extensions. So let's start with looking at a quilt. Now this is our Farmhouse Chic quilt, and this one is so much fun and so easy to do. And it's really interesting because we've put our focus fabric here in the block, so this would be a fun one to break that changing position rule. But we're going to talk about with the fabric and strips, so let's put this on the table, look at some fabric, and talk about that rule. So we have some gorgeous fabric here that I absolutely love. We've got some batiks, and our focus fabric here is this gorgeous blue and green batik with lots of movement in it. This is going to go everywhere you see the rose here. Our number 2 fabric, now as I remember, you take the focus out of the equation, compare the remaining 2. The lightest is typically the number 2 fabric, which is the white here, and the green is your number 3. This is so gorgeous, and it will go here in this block and on the border. And as you can see, these just pick up the color so beautifully. Now, before we get into that kit information, let's talk about our second rule that we love to break, and that is these strips. Now, let's get some background exactly on what we're referring to. So in our book that the quilt is in, the Farmhouse Chic, we actually tell you in the cutting instructions, we are going to be cutting a partial strip assembly, and from the same strip, we are going to be cutting some additional pieces. So typically when we do a strip assembly, what we do, let me just move this out of the way, is we take width of fabric strips, and you know that's about 44 inches, and we cut them selvage to selvage, and that gives us this long strip, and we're sewing them together, and then we cut our units from this. Now, with a partial, we're going to do that just a little bit different. So this is easy to understand to get our blocks. But with a partial, let me just set this over here. We have one of our strips that we've cut. Now this is a width of fabric strip, which is selvage to selvage. And the instructions tell us to cut a partial strip assembly. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut a small piece off of this width of fabric strip. So here is our partial strip assembly strip. And as you can see, it's a little smaller. Now the reason why we do this is because the full assembly was not quite enough to get all the blocks or units that we needed. We just needed a little bit more. So instead of cutting the whole strip and using it for a whole nother full assembly, we're just making a little assembly and just cutting a small one off. So this is what the little assembly would look like. Then we would continue cutting the rest of our pieces. Now, we have all of this strip left over. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the remainder of this strip after we cut our partial assembly, and we're going to cut some corner blocks, and we're going to cut some binding extensions. And if you we can just shift this over, and you can see there's plenty of fabric left here so that we can get another piece to add to our binding strip that we're going to sew end to end. And what this does is it allows us to use every single bit of this strip, so there's very little waste. This is a great rule that we love to break because it allows us to make the biggest quilt possible with the smallest amount of fabric, and that is savings for you. Now, talking about great quilt kits, let's look at the information on the quilt kit that we saw. It is called Turquoise Twirl. The number is 8022444. And once again, the pattern is Farmhouse Chic from our Easy Does It book. And we are suggesting the alternate pattern of Pretty Please. Now, rule number 3 is pressing your seams to the dark side. Now, I know that this has been a little controversial, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this and tell you why we so often love to press them open and break that rule. But first, let's look at the quilt. This quilt is Twinkles. Now this is from our brand new Make It Christmas book, which I love. And if you haven't seen it, you need to go check it out because this is a fun one to do. We've got a nice big block here to show off a beautiful focus fabric and a fun little twirl square here that really adds a lot of movement and interest. So let's check out the fabric. I just love this fabric because, one, it's very traditional Christmas, which I think is great. It has a nice big print on it, which lends itself so well to this bigger block in the Twinkles pattern. Now our number 2 is a little bit of like a parchment. Now once again, notice it is our lightest of the 3 for our number 2 position. And we've put it in the background so that the other 2 really pop off. And then our number 3, which is very pretty, it's on a dark background, and it's a little bit of a mimic of the big poinsettia here on this one. And that goes in the triangles here. Now, I like that it's a little smaller because the triangle's a little smaller, so it really helps to still see that print on the fabric whenever it's a smaller piece, although our big block can really show off our big fabric. Now, that's also, the number 3 is also on the border, which is fantastic. Now, when we're talking about seams and half square triangles and all of that good stuff, there's always that controversy about, Do we press to the dark side? Do we press open? Do we do a combination of each? Honestly, break the rule and do what you want to do. I have always gotten to where I love to press my seams open, and I like it because whenever we're doing a half square triangle block like this and we have a lot coming together, it really helps to press them open for the bulk. Now, that's kind of my little renegade thing that I love to do. I've just gotten to where I press everything open. It's very natural to me, and it always distributes the weight perfectly. I never get to the sewing machine and go, oh, I pressed it the wrong way. I need to alternate that and do it the other way. I don't have to think about it. It just keeps it simple, fun, and I get to just quilt and enjoy it. And then I know that it's always going to go together perfectly. So I love to press my seams open. So let's look at the quilt information on this. This is called Joyful Poinsettias, and the number is 8022184. The pattern is called Twinkles, and that is only available in the Make It Christmas book. And the alternate pattern that we're suggesting is Courtyard. Rule number 4 that we love to break is using a double fold binding. We prefer to use an economy binding, and we're going to talk all about that. Now, I have a special treat for you here. I'm going to show you an adorable quilt, but the binding has not been completed. So if it looks a little funny when we look at it, you'll know what's going on, but we're going to show you about that binding. So this quilt is bold blocks, and is this not the funnest thing? I love these mermaids here in this block with this little blue border here. It just really helps pop it. And then our number 2 is the background, has some sparkles to it. So let's look at this fabric and let's talk about this binding that's on here. Now, I think I'm a little girl at heart always, so whenever I see some of these little quilts, I always want them because I think they're so cute, and these colors are so up my alley. So this mermaid fabric is just darling in these blues and greens and all the fish and sea shells, that's kind of hard to say. And this big block here is just great. Now our number 2 fabric is this green, which is the perfect kind of aqua green. But what's really cool about this fabric is it has a great sparkle to it. So it almost looks like it's wet, but it's not. And that is all on the number 2 in the background here and on the border. Just adds such a great shimmer. And then our number 3 fabric is this blue, and it borders the block here as well as on our outer borders and our binding. And to me, it looks like bubbles. So I think it just works perfectly. Now let's talk about binding. I know a lot of you love a binding that is a double fold because you feel like that it's a lot more durable on your quilt. And I think double fold binding is great. However, with 3-yard quilts, we're trying to get as big of a quilt as we can out of that 3 yards of fabric. So we have opted to use an economy binding, which basically is a 1 1/4 inch strip that is pressed in folds put on the edge. And we're going to step that through now. Now, as I do this, let me just mention something. I have been doing 3-yard quilts for quite some years now. And I have to say that some of our very, very first quilts that I did have this economy binding on them, and to this day they have not worn out. And I know that there's a few that my family members have just loved to death, and it still is in great shape. So I'm a proponent of this, and I really think it makes a nice, clean, flat binding. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut a strip for your binding, and of course the instructions will step that out. We'll have a 1 1/4 inch strip. We are cutting the selvages off on the ends, and then we'll be sewing these end to end. And we do not use an angled seam. We actually sew them straight, which I'll show you that again in just a moment. We're going to turn it to the back side. I like to use a little bit of Mary Ellen's Best Press. I feel that this gives us a really nice, crisp fold when we iron it, and it really helps to hold it in place. We are going to match our edges here. Now let me grab this iron, and we're going to just fold it in half. This will be our very first step in our economy binding. Now after you do that, you're going to iron all of it just like that, matching the raw edges. Then we're going to open it up, and we're going to take one edge and press it to the center. Now it's a little bit hard to start sometimes on an end, but once you get going, you can see that it can go really, really well. And that middle seam gives you a nice guideline to turn that under. And then we're going to take it and fold it in half again on that first seam and press again. You can see how beautiful that is. Now, let me just mention a couple of things too. You notice these little blue things I have on my fingers? These are our thermal thimbles, and I love these because when I'm pressing binding, it keeps my fingers from getting burned. So this is kind of one of those musts when doing binding, as well as that Mary Ellen's Best Press. That's an awesome product. So here we have our binding, and of course you would do all of this. Now I'm going to move this out of the way, and we're going to look at the binding on the quilt itself. Okay, so what we've done here, as you can see, we have not turned this binding to the back yet. So you can tell that this is our strip here, and it's folded in half, and it's the same, just like that. We've used a scant 1/4 inch seam to sew it to the front edge of the quilt. So as I mentioned earlier, we do sew our binding strips together with straight seams, and you can see here that they're just a regular seam, sewing those strips end to end, and not an angled seam. So this is another way that we save lots of fabric for our binding and keep it in economy binding. So we've got our scant 1/4 inch, we've got our nice pressed fold with Mary Ellen's Best Press. That's what keeps it nice and clean while we're working with it, so it doesn't come unpressed. So we're going to turn this to the back. And as you can see, the pressed edge, the very center press, is going to be on the edge of the quilt, and then the pressed under edge is to the back, and then we can just do our handwork right here. And we usually do like to do our handwork on the back side and do the machine work on the front and turn it that way. That way it makes a really nice clean edge. And I tell you what, it's a staple around here. We all bind while we watch movies, and we just love it, and this is a great thing to do while you're hand binding. So that is our rule number 4 that we love to break. But before we go, let me show you this fabric and get you the kit information, because you're going to want this. This is darling. Our kit number on this kit is 8022445. It is called Mer-Mazing, and it is the Bold Blocks pattern from the Pretty Darn Quick book. Now, rule number 5 that we love to break are planned placement of border seams. Now, this is a little bit of a different thing, but in economy quilting, as I've said several times, we try to make the largest quilt possible from all of the 3 yards. So we want to be able to get as economy quilt as we can by just placing those seams where they fall. So let me show you that and show you this darling quilt. So this is our 9+1 quilt, and this is just a super one to put together. It's really fast and easy, just a simple 9 patch here and a nice little block here. And you can see we have some borders that are just beautiful on this quilt. So let's put it on the table, look at the fabric. Now I have some really fun fabric for this one. And these are just darling puppy dogs. I just love it. And this is our focus fabric, and this is going to go everywhere you see the ballerinas here. And then our number 2 fabric is this fun white, and this makes me think of, you know, when you tie the bandana around the puppy's neck. I think it's so cute, and it's just perfect with the puppies. And this fabric is going to go everywhere the pink is on the border and in our 9 patch. And then our number 3 fabric is this great red, and let's look at that with the dogs. Isn't that great? It just picks up all the reds on his collars. Just great, in the little pink tongues. And that's going to go everywhere the purple is. So this is just absolutely darling. Now let's talk about border seams. So in 3-yard quilts, one of the things that we do is we like to cut border strips, and we'll give you a number in the pattern of how many strips to cut. We do sew them with a straight seam, not with an angle seam. And what we do is we have you sew them all together end to end. So you're going to have one big long strip, which is great. Then what we do is we sew the sides on, and then we trim them and cut and sew the tops on. And this allows us to get as much border as we possibly can from your fabric. Now, if you'll notice here, I'm going to move this quilt over. Now, typically, whenever a lot of quilters will want this seam on the border to line up with one of the seams on the blocks. And we have decided to just bypass that, just sew our borders on, make it super easy, and I bet you never once noticed that they were not lined up. So it's a really fun rule that we love to break. So let's talk about the kit number on this darling fabric. This kit is called Dog's Day Out, and the number is 8022446. It is our 9+1 pattern, and it is from the Quilts for Kids book. Now, these were 5 rules that I love to break, making 3-yard quilts and putting the fun back in quilting. What are some of the rules that you love to break? I would love to hear it. Post that comment down in the bottom, and maybe I can learn some more fun things to do in quilting. Appreciate you joining us today. It's Fran Morgan. Have a great one.